The supper had begun with elegance and ended in whispers. It was the sort of affair that the society pages gushed over, an autumn gathering at Varnum Hall, the ivy-clad estate of Lady Francesca Ellingsworth, nestled discreetly in the Hampshire countryside. The guest list had been as exclusive as it was eclectic. A diplomat, a novelist, a baron, an actress, a clergyman, and an American industrialist, all seated beneath the glittering chandeliers of a drawing-room that had seen centuries of whispered scandal. At precisely 7:30, the first course had been served. A velouté of chestnut and truffle, paired with a discreet white burgundy. Baron Ambrose von Rollinek, guest of honor and benefactor to a slew of cultural institutions across Europe, had been seated at Lady Francesca's right, wearing his signature velvet dinner jacket and a discreet gold pin shaped like a hawk's talon. The Baron was known for his wealth, his obscure lineage, some vague Austro-Hungarian nobility, and his tireless support for the arts. His voice, sonorous and deliberate, had been heard reciting snippets of Rilke to Lady Francesca, who laughed a moment too brightly. And then he was gone. He had not left the table. No footman had seen him rise. One moment he was sipping his second glass of burgundy. The next, the space between Lady Francesca and the Reverend Pendlebury was empty, his chair pushed in neatly. At first, no one reacted. Conversation continued, unaware of the strangeness. It was only during the fish course, halibut à la Véronique, that Lady Francesca's eyes widened. "Ambrose," she had asked, her voice lilting with amusement. "Have you become invisible, my dear?" The guests laughed, but the Baron did not reappear. A discreet search followed. 1 or 2 footmen were dispatched. The butler, Mr. Trowbridge, returned with a composed face that concealed a ripple of confusion. "The Baron von Rollinek is not in the house," he said gravely. The reaction was swift. Lady Francesca clutched her pearls with a dramatist's flair. The Reverend Pendlebury muttered something about the devil's tricks. Mr. Clyde Thacker, the industrialist from Pittsburgh, poured himself a third brandy and muttered, "Hell of a vanishing act." Only one person at the table remained entirely unaffected. A small man with a moustache as precise as his manners, dressed immaculately in a charcoal gray suit, sat silently at the far end of the table, the candlelight gleaming off his patent leather shoes. His head tilted ever so slightly to the right, as if listening for a note out of tune. Monsieur Hercule Poirot did not move. He did not panic. He simply watched. Lady Francesca, sensing that hysteria might be premature, summoned her sense of control and turned toward Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, forgive me, but this is highly irregular. You don't suppose it couldn't be some prank?" Poirot raised one delicate eyebrow. A man of nobility, wealth, and theatrical inclination. Perhaps. But such disappearances, madame, tend to conceal purpose rather than whimsy. She blinked. "You mean he chose to disappear?" "I say nothing, yet, but I observe." Poirot pushed back his chair. "And now, if you please, I will begin with a tour of the house." Mr. Thacker barked a laugh. "You expect to find him hiding in a linen closet, Poirot?" "I expect to find something, monsieur. That is the difference." The hall was searched from attic to cellar. The staff confirmed that no carriages or automobiles had left the estate since the guests had arrived. The gates, locked at 8, were watched by an ex-military groundskeeper who swore no one had exited through the iron main entrance. A heavy fog had settled on the moor beyond, and the dogs, great loping Irish wolfhounds, had remained still and unbothered. It was as if Baron von Rollinek had ceased to exist. In the drawing-room, Poirot requested that the guests remain for the evening. "This is not merely a matter of social inconvenience," he said gently. "When a man vanishes without explanation, one must consider all possibilities, theft, abduction, or worse." Lady Francesca looked stricken. "Murder?" "It would be premature to assume," Poirot said. but let us not underestimate the cunning of the human mind. One by one, the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The assembled party numbered 10, not including staff: Lady Francesca Ellingsworth, hostess, widow of Sir Reginald, patroness of the arts; Baron Ambrose von Rollinek, vanished nobleman; Reverend Theodore Pindlebury, the vicar of nearby St. Winifred's, a man with gentle hands and trembling speech; Miss Evelyn Cray, rising actress, known for a scandalous stage turn in La Fin des Vers; Mr. Clyde Thacker, a steel tycoon from America, with a booming voice and a thick mustache; Dr. Giles Merriweather, an expert in psychoanalysis with cold grey eyes and impeccable cufflinks; Mrs. Agatha Merriweather, his wife, a painter whose melancholic portraits had become the talk of certain London galleries; Mr. Lionel Bracewell, a novelist with 3 failed marriages and an impressive pipe; Miss Cecily Duval, Lady Francesca's goddaughter, intelligent and poised, recently returned from Geneva; Monsieur Hercule Poirot, detective, a perfect closed circle. No one had entered, no one had left. Yet the Baron was gone. Later that night, Poirot sat alone in the library, nursing a tisane. On the table beside him lay a single object: the Baron's hawk-shaped pin found beneath the heavy tapestry that hung behind his chair at supper. Poirot studied it closely. The clasp was unbroken. The gold gleamed. And yet, Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. The clues were already forming a pattern of behavior, not footprints. It was not how the Baron vanished that mattered. It was why, and in that why, Hercule Poirot sensed, was the secret to the entire affair. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its orange glow painting shadows across the room where Hercule Poirot sat, deep in thought. The guests, restless and uneasy, had been instructed to remain in the drawing-room while the investigation proceeded. It was already past midnight, and the peculiar sense of stillness that blanketed Varnum Hall seemed to echo the baffling disappearance of Baron von Rollinek. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the Baron's hawk-shaped pin once more. It was the only tangible evidence left in the wake of his vanishing act, yet it seemed to hold more significance than its apparent simplicity suggested. He had already gathered a few preliminary facts which, in isolation, were inconclusive. But Poirot knew better than to rely on mere appearances. He stood up, the soft creak of his chair breaking the silence. A step toward the door, and then a soft knock. The butler, Mr. Trowbridge, entered with his usual air of practiced composure. "Monsieur Poirot, if you please," Trowbridge said, his voice steady but tinged with the unease that had begun to pervade the household. "The guests are waiting as you instructed. They are eager for some clarification." Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on the pin before he placed it carefully back on the table. "I will attend to them now, Mr. Trowbridge. But first, a word with you." The butler's brow furrowed, but he remained silent as Poirot motioned for him to sit. Poirot's mind was already working, sifting through the impressions of the evening, pulling at threads of behavior and psychology. "The Baron's pin," Poirot began softly. "Was it found exactly where you say it was? Beneath the tapestry?" Trowbridge nodded, his face betraying nothing but the practiced mask of a servant. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. It was tucked beneath the edge, just as you saw it. I found it myself upon inspecting the area after we could not find the Baron." Poirot's sharp gaze never left the butler's face. "You are certain no one else has been near that area?" "Quite certain, sir. I'm the one who placed it on the table before you." "Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Trowbridge." Poirot's tone was polite, though his mind had already moved on. The butler had been careful, but the mind of a detective is seldom fooled by carelessness, and Poirot had not seen a single sign of disturbance in the room that might suggest a struggle or even a rushed departure. He rose from his chair and turned to the door. "Now, I must return to my investigation. Bring the others to me one by one, Mr. Trowbridge, and let us not keep them waiting too long." With a bow, the butler left to summon the guests, leaving Poirot alone with his thoughts. The next few minutes passed in a blur as Poirot prepared himself for what was to come. He knew that beneath the veneer of politeness and social grace, each of these people had something to hide, something that could explain the Baron's sudden and inexplicable disappearance. One by one, the guests were ushered into the small study where Poirot awaited them. First came the Reverend Pindlebury, his brow furrowed with what seemed like genuine concern. But Poirot was not fooled by his nervous mannerisms. The clergyman's discomfort was more likely due to his overactive conscience than any real guilt. "Reverend, you were at the table when the Baron vanished," Poirot began, his tone gentle but probing. "Can you recall anything unusual about the moment he disappeared?" The Reverend's eyes darted about the room, his hands clasped in front of him as if in prayer. I can't say. It was so sudden. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Surely you don't think—" He trailed off, his voice thick with fear. Poirot's expression softened, though his mind was already calculating. "No, Reverend. I do not think it was anything supernatural, but I do think it was something carefully planned." He paused, watching the man closely. "What did you notice about the Baron's behavior before he vanished?" The Reverend hesitated, glancing down at his feet as if searching for words. "Nothing unusual. He was quiet, yes. But he had been speaking with Lady Francesca just before—" "Speaking with Lady Francesca?" Poirot interrupted. "What were they speaking of?" The Reverend blinked, surprised at the question. "I'm not sure, sir. Poetry, I believe. Rilke, perhaps. They both seemed very absorbed." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Rilke, yes. But was it truly poetry, or something else entirely? The question lingered in his mind as he dismissed the Reverend and awaited the next guest. Miss Evelyn Cray entered the room with the kind of self-assurance only an actress could possess. Her presence was commanding, her posture perfect, and her smile, though carefully cultivated, felt slightly strained. Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. "Miss Cray," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet, "you, like the Reverend, were seated at the table when the Baron vanished. What can you tell me of his behavior?" She tilted her head as if considering the question. "Well, it's all a bit of a blur now, isn't it? I mean, who could have expected such a thing? One moment we're all enjoying our supper, and the next, poof, gone." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But now that I think about it, the Baron did seem somewhat preoccupied, as if he were listening intently, but not to any of us." Poirot leaned forward. "Listening to whom?" The actress's smile faltered for a moment. "I couldn't say, really. It was almost as if he were listening to the air itself." Poirot's mind raced. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such strange behavior. A person who listens to the air. What could that mean? A message, perhaps? Or a signal? He gave a small, imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Miss Cray. I shall have more questions for you later." She gave a stiff nod and left the room, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. By the time the last guest entered, the novelist, Mr. Lionel Bracewell, Poirot had already formed a few tentative conclusions. But there was still much to be learned. Bracewell was a man of middle age, his face careworn, his hair thinning. Yet he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had made a name for himself in the literary world. As he sat across from Poirot, he placed a pipe between his teeth and exhaled a plume of smoke. "I understand, Monsieur Poirot, that you have questions regarding the Baron's disappearance," Bracewell said in a voice that was as measured as his demeanor. "I must admit, I'm as baffled as anyone. The man vanished into thin air." Poirot studied him carefully. "Mr. Bracewell, you have known the Baron for some time." "A few years. We were acquainted through mutual friends. I believe we shared a similar appreciation for the finer things in life," the novelist replied with a wry smile. "Why do you ask?" Because, Mr. Bracewell, the finest things in life often conceal the most dangerous truths, Poirot said. And I suspect the Baron's disappearance is no mere accident. The novelist raised an eyebrow. What makes you so sure of that? Poirot smiled. Because, monsieur, nothing in life ever truly disappears without leaving behind a trace, and I intend to find that trace. Bracewell's expression faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough. Poirot knew he had struck a nerve. As Poirot continued to piece together the puzzle of Baron von Rollinek's disappearance, the guests' various reactions, their nerves, their inconsistencies, their evasions, began to form a clearer picture. But still, the most important question remained unanswered. Why? Why had the Baron vanished, and what was the true motive behind his disappearance? Poirot was sure that the key to solving this mystery lay within the guests themselves. Each had a secret, a motive, a reason to conceal the truth, and Poirot would not rest until he had uncovered them all. The night dragged on, and Hercule Poirot found himself once more seated in the library, his fingers steepled under his chin, his mind turning over the information he had gathered. The guests were unsettled, each retreating to their respective rooms, their minds no doubt filled with speculations about the disappearance of the Baron. Yet, while they mulled over their own theories, Poirot's thoughts were already in motion, weaving together a tapestry of motives, half-answers, and unexplained behaviors. The room was quiet now, save for the crackle of the fire. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the estate in an impenetrable veil. Poirot found it fitting. There was a sense of mist hanging over the case itself, a fog of deception that could only be cleared by the precision of his reasoning. At the center of his thoughts was the hawk-shaped pin. It seemed so small, so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, yet he could not shake the feeling that it was the key to understanding the entire mystery. He had been careful to note every detail about it. The craftsmanship, the pin's clasp, the way it had been discarded beneath the tapestry. It had not been dropped in haste, as though in a struggle. No, it had been placed there deliberately, with careful intent. There was something in that deliberate placement that gnawed at him. But why? Poirot stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked over to the window. The moonlight reflected off the fog, giving the landscape an eerie, almost otherworldly quality. The Baron had vanished without a trace, yet someone in that room had to know what had happened. Someone had to have the answer. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, the fog still clinging to the ground like a heavy blanket. Poirot had already risen early, his mind unable to rest, his curiosity insatiable. He had requested that the guests return to the drawing-room after breakfast for further questioning. Each one had been given a specific time slot, and Poirot intended to methodically revisit his earlier impressions. The first to arrive was the Reverend. His face was drawn, as though sleep had evaded him the night before, and his usual calm demeanor had been replaced with a nervous energy. As he sat across from Poirot, his fingers twitched uncomfortably, his gaze shifting from the detective to the empty space where the Baron had once sat. "Reverend, you have had time to reflect on the events of last night?" Poirot asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Yes, I have," Pendlebury replied, his voice cracking slightly. "And I must admit I am at a loss. It's not like anything I've ever encountered before. Baron von Rollinek simply disappeared." Poirot studied him closely, noting the nervous tick in the Reverend's left hand as it tapped rhythmically against the arm of his chair. "Indeed, it is perplexing. But you must understand, Reverend, that in times such as these the mind often seeks to explain the unexplainable. You must not let fear cloud your judgment." The Reverend nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You are right, of course. I must try to be more composed. But what is the explanation, Poirot? Where could he possibly have gone?" Poirot leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "That is precisely what I intend to find out, but I must ask you, Reverend, was there anything unusual in the way the Baron behaved before he vanished? Anything that might suggest he knew his time was running out? The Reverend swallowed, his throat tight. I don't think so. He was as he always was, polite and refined. But I did notice something strange during supper. He seemed distracted, almost as if he were listening to something that wasn't there, something beyond the conversation at the table. Poirot's brow furrowed. Beyond the conversation? Tell me more. The Reverend hesitated, clearly unsure of what he was about to say. He was looking around the room as if searching for something, but his eyes were fixed, almost unblinking. It was unsettling. Poirot's mind raced, but his face remained impassive. Thank you, Reverend. That is valuable information. Please remain here while I speak to the others. The Reverend nodded, his relief palpable, and rose to leave. Poirot remained in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as he turned over the new detail. The Baron had been looking for something, searching for something unseen. It was the sort of behavior that could easily be dismissed as eccentricity or a passing distraction, but Poirot's intuition told him otherwise. It was an important detail, one that could explain his disappearance. Next came Miss Evelyn Cray, who entered with an air of practiced elegance. She wore a silk gown that shimmered slightly in the soft morning light, her eyes fixed on Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something guarded. She seated herself gracefully across from him, her posture perfect, but Poirot detected a subtle tension in her shoulders. Miss Cray, I would like to revisit our conversation from last night, Poirot began. You mentioned that the Baron appeared preoccupied during supper. Can you tell me more about what you observed? She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I believe I've already told you everything I know. The Baron was distant, yes, but isn't that the nature of many men of his status? They are often consumed by their own thoughts, lost in their own world. Poirot studied her carefully, sensing that there was more to her story than she was letting on. And yet, you did say that he appeared to be listening to something beyond the conversation. Could you elaborate on that? What do you think he was hearing? For the briefest moment, Miss Cray's gaze flickered, an imperceptible shift, but Poirot saw it. She was hiding something. I'm not sure, she said, her voice tight. Perhaps he was simply distracted. It could have been anything. It's nothing to concern yourself with. Poirot allowed a small smile to curl at the corners of his lips. But it is something to concern myself with, Miss Cray. You see, in my line of work, it is the smallest details that often lead to the greatest revelations, and I am certain that you know more than you are letting on. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but she stopped herself. A moment of silence passed, and Poirot leaned forward. You may not wish to speak, Miss Cray, but I will find the truth nonetheless. I always do. For a moment, Miss Cray met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she spoke again, her voice softer, almost reluctant. I don't know what the Baron was hearing, but I do know this. Just before he vanished, he seemed agitated. His hand was trembling slightly. And then, just as the others were laughing, I saw him glance at the door as though waiting for someone. Poirot nodded slowly. Someone. And did you recognize that person? Miss Cray shook her head. No, but it wasn't anyone who had been seated at the table. I'm sure of it. Poirot's mind raced. The Baron had been waiting for someone, and that someone had not been among the guests. The final detail had emerged, but it raised more questions than it answered. The Baron had been expecting someone. But who? As Poirot sat back in his chair, he couldn't help but feel that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The Baron's disappearance was not a random act. It was part of a larger scheme, a plan that involved deception, misdirection, and, most likely, betrayal. Someone in this room had been involved. But who? Poirot knew that the answers were hidden in the behavior of the guests themselves. It was time to draw the threads together. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Poirot stood by the window for a moment, watching the fog press against the glass like a living thing. The pieces were coming together, but there was still something elusive, something missing. He had been expecting more from the suspects, but their responses had only raised more questions. Miss Craye's hesitation, the Reverend's nervous energy, the Baron's strange behavior at supper, they all pointed toward a single truth, but there was still no clear answer. It was as if the fog had crept into his mind, clouding his thoughts with uncertainty. But Poirot knew better than to let frustration cloud his judgment. Every detail, no matter how small, held meaning. He had seen this pattern before, how the smallest flaw in a story could unravel the entire lie. He turned from the window, his eyes narrowing as he returned to the drawing room. His footsteps echoed through the empty hall, the silence heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. He had interviewed everyone, and yet he had not yet asked the one question that might reveal the truth. It was time to confront them all. The guests were assembled in the drawing room, each one looking slightly apprehensive, as though they knew the net was tightening around them. The room was quiet, save for the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of a teacup. Poirot entered, his presence commanding, his steps deliberate. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "I have spent much time reflecting on the events of last evening, and I now require your full cooperation. You are all involved in this matter in one way or another. It is imperative that I understand each of your positions more clearly." The Reverend, who had been sitting by the fire, looked up, his brow furrowed with worry. "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot? We've already told you everything we know." Poirot glanced briefly at the Reverend, then turned his gaze to Miss Craye, who was sitting near the window, her eyes avoiding his. "Ah, but you see, what I know is not yet enough. I need to understand your behavior last night, every look, every gesture, every word. It is these things, these small revelations, that lead me to the truth." There was a slight stir in the room, but no one spoke. Poirot let the silence hang in the air, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, without another word, he began to pace, his footsteps measured, deliberate. "Miss Craye," he said suddenly, his eyes turning toward her, "you have been most elusive in our conversations. I find this curious, but it is not your silence that intrigues me. It is your eyes. You see, Miss Craye, when you speak I observe that your eyes are quick to dart to the door, as though you were expecting someone not present." The room fell still. Miss Craye's hand, which had been resting delicately on the arm of her chair, twitched. Her lips parted, but she did not speak. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering. "Uh-huh," Poirot continued, his tone sharpening slightly. "You see, I notice everything. The way your gaze shifts, the way your hand trembles. It tells me something. It tells me you are lying. And you are lying about more than the Baron's disappearance." A flush crept up Miss Craye's neck, but she kept her composure. "I don't know what you mean, Poirot," she replied, her voice a little too steady. "I've told you everything I know." Poirot took a step forward, his expression stern. "No, you have not. You have not told me about the other person, the one the Baron was waiting for, the one you know." The room held its breath. The tension was palpable. Miss Craye's eyes widened, but she said nothing, her lips pressed tightly together. Poirot turned his attention to the others. The Baron was not alone in his disappearance. There is someone in this room who knows more than they are letting on. Perhaps it is you, Reverend Pendlebury. Perhaps it is you, Lord Fenton. Or maybe it is someone else entirely. Lord Fenton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking toward the door. Poirot's gaze was like a scalpel cutting through his unease. "Lord Fenton," Poirot said softly, his tone almost conversational, "you look uncomfortable. Why? You have been the least forthcoming with me." Your answers are vague, and your demeanor suggests you are hiding something. What is it? Fenton's mouth tightened, but he did not speak. Poirot continued, undeterred. I know that you are lying, Lord Fenton. You may not have noticed, but your posture betrays you. Your hands are tense, your shoulders stiff. You're bracing yourself for something. Fenton's jaw clenched, but still, he remained silent. Poirot turned back to Miss Cray. Do you know this person the Baron was waiting for, Miss Cray? Do you know who he was expecting? Miss Cray's eyes darted toward the door again, and Poirot's gaze followed hers. She seemed to hesitate, as though weighing the consequences of revealing the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I do, she admitted, her voice tinged with reluctance. The Baron was expecting someone who was not part of the party. He had a meeting arranged with someone. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And who was this person, Miss Cray? She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the faces of the others as though searching for support. But no one spoke, and no one moved. Finally, she sighed, resigned. It was Lord Fenton, she said, her voice shaking slightly. The Baron was meeting with Lord Fenton last night, but something went wrong. Poirot's heart quickened, though his expression remained unreadable. Something went wrong? What happened? Miss Cray looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I don't know for certain, but I overheard them arguing just before the Baron vanished. It was loud but brief. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but it sounded like Lord Fenton was angry. He said something about a debt, then there was silence. And after that, the Baron was gone. Poirot took a deep breath, allowing the weight of this new information to settle. Lord Fenton had been the Baron's secret meeting partner, and whatever had transpired between them, it had led to the Baron's disappearance. It was a step closer, but still, the puzzle was far from complete. Poirot's mind raced. What had caused Fenton to turn on the Baron? What had been the nature of their argument? And more importantly, where had the Baron gone? Without a word, Poirot turned and walked toward the door. The guests watched him, unsure of what to expect. I will return shortly, he said, his voice calm but resolute. There is more to this than meets the eye. As Poirot exited the room, his mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the case. He would get to the bottom of it. He always did. Poirot moved swiftly through the hall, his mind whirring with the new information Miss Cray had provided. Lord Fenton's involvement was undeniable, and yet the Baron's disappearance still felt like a mystery with too many loose ends. A confrontation had taken place. There was no doubt in Poirot's mind about that. But why had Lord Fenton, of all people, become so angry? What was the nature of their argument? And more importantly, why had the Baron vanished without a trace? He stepped into the library, the place where the guests had gathered earlier. There was something about the room that felt out of place now, as if it, too, held secrets that only the right pair of eyes could see. The bookshelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, towered over him, but it wasn't the literary works that interested Poirot. No, he was looking for something much smaller, something far less conspicuous, a clue, a detail, a moment of human frailty. Poirot's eyes scanned the room, but nothing immediately caught his attention. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn tightly. There was a faint smell of pipe tobacco lingering in the air, but beyond that, there was nothing of immediate interest. He had expected more, something that would tell him where the Baron had gone or who had been involved in his disappearance. He was about to leave when a sound stopped him in his tracks, a faint rustling noise, like the shuffle of papers. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he moved quietly toward the far corner of the room where a small desk stood. As he drew closer, he saw that one of the drawers was slightly ajar. He opened it gently, careful not to disturb anything. Inside, nestled beneath a stack of papers, was an envelope. The envelope was unmarked, its edges worn, as though it had been opened before. Poirot's fingers lingered on the edges for a moment. Then he slipped it free and carefully unfolded the letter inside. It was a single sheet of paper, written in a hurried hand, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a rush. Poirot's lips moved silently as he read the contents. "If you want to get out of this alive, you need to meet me. Midnight, the old mill. Come alone. Do not tell anyone." The letter was unsigned, but its message was clear. The Baron had been in some sort of trouble, and he had been given an ultimatum. The use of the word alive struck Poirot immediately. It suggested not just a business dispute, but something far more dangerous, something with life-and-death consequences. But why had the Baron been so secretive? Why hadn't he mentioned the meeting to anyone? And who had written this note? Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities, trying to fit the pieces together. A soft sound behind him made Poirot turn quickly. It was Miss Cray, her face pale, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot, I'm sorry to intrude, but I had to speak with you." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze softening as he observed her. "What is it, mademoiselle?" She stepped into the room, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though she feared someone might be watching. "I don't know if this is important," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I remembered something. When Lord Fenton and the Baron were arguing last night, I overheard part of their conversation. I wasn't meant to hear it, of course, but..." Poirot's interest piqued. "Continue." "I didn't understand everything," Miss Cray said, biting her lip, "but I heard Fenton mention a name. It wasn't clear, he said it so quickly, but it sounded like Martin. I'm sure it was Martin." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The name meant nothing to him at first, but then he remembered the old acquaintances he had heard Lord Fenton speak of in passing. Was there a connection between them? And why had Fenton mentioned someone named Martin during the argument? "Martin, you say?" Poirot repeated slowly, his mind working furiously. "Do you remember anything else? Did Fenton say anything else about this Martin?" Miss Cray shook her head. "No, that's all, but I have a feeling it's important." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Indeed, mademoiselle, you have done well. This Martin is a key figure. It is now a matter of discovering his identity." But Miss Cray wasn't finished. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "There's one more thing," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure how it fits into all of this, but I think you should know. Before the Baron disappeared, he said something strange to me." Poirot tilted his head, intrigued. "What did he say?" Miss Cray hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "He said, 'The one you trust will betray you.' He said it in such a cold way, as though he knew something. Something terrible was about to happen. I don't know why he said it, but I can't stop thinking about it." Poirot's eyes sharpened. A betrayal. The Baron had been expecting someone. Had Fenton betrayed him? Had the Baron's disappearance been a result of a personal vendetta? Or was there someone else involved? Someone hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike? Poirot straightened, his mind clearer than ever. He knew where he had to go next. He turned to Miss Cray, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you for your assistance, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." She nodded, but Poirot could see the uncertainty still in her eyes. "I only want to know what happened to the Baron." "Of course," Poirot replied softly, a hint of sympathy in his tone. "And we shall find out, mademoiselle. I will uncover the truth." With that, Poirot made his way out of the room, his mind already focused on the next step of his investigation. He had a name, Martin, and that name would lead him to the answers he sought. The pieces were falling into place. The game was afoot. Poirot did not return immediately to his suite. Instead, He asked discreetly for the address of the old mill mentioned in the note he had found in the library. The estate butler, a wiry man named Sedgwick with a habit of blinking far too often, hesitated before giving directions. "It's quite derelict, sir. Down a lane past the orchard and through the woods. Nobody's gone there in years. A bit dangerous, they say. The floorboards are half rotten." Poirot thanked him with a polite nod and, rather than waiting for darkness to fall, set off toward the place at once. Midnight might have been the assigned hour in the letter, but the urgency in Poirot's little grey cells would not permit him to wait. He needed to understand the setting, the staging ground of what now seemed likely to be the Baron's final voluntary movement. The walk was quiet, muffled under the hush of trees and the crackling whispers of dry leaves underfoot. The orchard he passed was tidy, unnaturally so, another sign of Lord Fenton's preference for control and presentation. But the path to the mill quickly diverged from such order. It wound into the trees, narrow and damp, the undergrowth reclaiming the forgotten route. When Poirot finally reached the structure, he paused to study it. The old mill was little more than a skeleton of its former self. Walls of crumbling stone, a roof half caved in, and a great rusted wheel leaning against one side, moss devouring its iron teeth. The windows were either boarded or shattered, and a large crack ran through the chimney like a jagged scar. Poirot entered carefully, avoiding the center of the floor, which bowed dangerously. The room smelt of mildew and decayed wood. It was quiet, too quiet, and yet Poirot could feel the presence of recent activity. Dust patterns were broken, and his eyes, trained over years of patient scrutiny, noted a boot print in the corner, still crisp in a patch of dirt where rain had entered through the roof. Someone had stood there, waiting. Another set of marks. Scuffed heel drags, uneven, suggested a person had left in haste. Not a struggle, but alarmed movement. He crouched, examining a small gouge in the wooden floor, and the imprint of a heel, deep enough to have been made by someone shifting their weight suddenly. And then a glint, something metallic tucked beneath a broken board near the far wall. Poirot retrieved it delicately. A cufflink. Gold. Monogrammed. BVD. The Baron's. Poirot straightened slowly, frowning. The Baron had come here, no doubt, but if this was a rendezvous, it had ended poorly. And the fact that the cufflink had not been retrieved, so unlike a man as particular about appearance as the Baron, suggested something had occurred that forced him to flee or had rendered him unable to collect his belongings. Had the note been a trap? As he stepped back outside, the sun now low on the horizon, Poirot's thoughts returned to the name Miss Cray had overheard. Marty. It tugged at something in the back of his mind, something he had not yet placed. He returned to the house and asked discreetly to see the guest registry, the one kept by the household for formal events. Lord Fenton's dinners were known to attract not only family but persons of influence. A guest book would be kept, and perhaps in it a forgotten signature. The book was brought to him by Sedgwick and laid on a side table in the study. Poirot turned pages delicately, noting names. Lady Holbrook, Major Erskine, Dr. Falk, Lady Aurelia's cousin from Vienna, the foreign attaché from Brussels. But there it was, halfway down a page, written in a hasty scrawl quite unlike the careful calligraphy of the others. Martin L. Ravenswood. Poirot tapped the name, gently with one finger, then rang for Sedgwick again. "This man, Ravenswood. Has he been a frequent visitor?" The butler gave a slight start. "No, sir. He's only been once, and that was nearly a year ago. Arrived without much notice. Lord Fenton said he was an old friend from university days, but, if I may say so, there was a tension that evening." Poirot leaned forward. "What kind of tension?" Sedgwick hesitated. "It's difficult to say exactly, sir, only that the Baron wasn't his usual self. The two of them spoke alone in the billiards room, and afterward the Baron seemed shaken. He retired early that night. And this Ravenswood, what became of him?" He left the next morning. No one has seen him since, at least not to my knowledge. Poirot sat back. A connection was forming. If Martin Ravenswood had ties to both the Baron and Lord Fenton, and had been involved in some prior conflict, it was possible that he had returned, perhaps under a different guise, perhaps in secret. But why now, and for what purpose? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by Inspector Catchpool entering the room, looking flustered. "Ah, Poirot, I've been looking for you. You'll want to hear this." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Speak, mon ami." "A message was delivered this afternoon," Catchpool said, holding out a folded note. "No return address. Just left at the gatehouse." Poirot took it, eyes narrowing as he opened the folded paper. The message inside was simple, typed on an old machine. "You're looking in the wrong direction. The Baron left because he wanted to. He was afraid of something he had done. He made an enemy years ago, and that debt has come due. Stop looking for a criminal. The crime is already behind you." There was no signature, no name. Poirot held the note up to the light, studying the typeface. "This is not a warning," he said softly. "It is a redirection. Someone wants us to believe the Baron fled of his own volition. But why? If the Baron simply ran, why leave a cufflink behind? Why arrange a midnight meeting?" Catchpool scratched his head. "It sounds like a scare tactic. Someone trying to get us off the trail." Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed. And that tells us that the trail it is close. Very close. The truth is not behind us, as the note says. It lies ahead, just out of reach." He stood and glanced toward the door. "I must speak to Lord Fenton again." When Poirot found him, Lord Fenton was in the smoking lounge, a brandy in hand and a distracted expression on his face. He seemed unsurprised to see the detective. "Back so soon?" he asked, sipping the amber liquid. Poirot's tone was light. "Always. I find that it is best to strike while the iron is hot. And there are some irons here which are scalding, I think." Fenton gave a dry chuckle. "Is that so?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Tell me about Martin Ravenswood." The brandy glass paused midway, to Fenton's lips. "Ravenswood? Yes, he was here last year, no. An old friend, perhaps." Fenton set the glass down carefully. "Old friend, yes, though I wouldn't call it a warm friendship. We were once close at Oxford. Then things soured. He was involved in some unpleasant business abroad. Financial scandal. Disgraced. Came to see me, hoping for help. I declined. And the Baron. How did he know him?" Fenton hesitated. "They crossed paths years ago. Europe. I believe there was a joint venture, but I don't know the details. I tried to stay out of it." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet the Baron met someone at the old mill. Someone who left him with no time to retrieve his own cufflink." Fenton's eyes flickered. "Are you suggesting Ravenswood is here?" "I do not suggest, Lord Fenton. I only ask questions. The answers, they will come." Fenton said nothing, but his grip on the brandy glass tightened. Poirot turned toward the door, but paused. "If you are hiding something, mon ami, I implore you, do not wait until the final act. In matters such as these, delay is often the difference between justice and tragedy." And with that, Poirot left, certain now that the name Martin Ravenswood was more than a ghost from the past. He was the shadow now cast across the whole affair, and shadows, Poirot knew, always clung closest to the source of light. Poirot's steps echoed in the grand hall as he left Lord Fenton, the weight of his thoughts pressing down upon him. Something was amiss in this mansion, something not yet revealed, though it was lurking just beyond the shadows. He had no intention of allowing the Baron's disappearance to become another forgotten mystery. If there was one thing Poirot knew, it was that the truth was always there, patiently waiting to be uncovered. The question was not whether it would be revealed, but when. As Poirot made his way to his room, his mind continued to churn over the latest revelations. The name Martin Ravenswood and the curious details surrounding him had become the keystone of the investigation. Ravenswood had not simply vanished from the scene after his meeting with Lord Fenton and the Baron. No, he had remained a shadow, casting uncertainty over the entire affair. Why had Fenton been so evasive about his past connection with Ravenswood? And why, after all this time, had the man returned? The rattle of a carriage passing outside caught his attention. The sound was peculiar, a single, solitary carriage at this hour. Poirot's gaze shifted toward the window, and for a fleeting moment he wondered whether it might be some new development in the case. Yet when he drew back the curtain, he saw only the distant lights of the village fading into the night. Perhaps it was time to speak with the household staff again. They had their own perspectives, often more observant than one might expect, and it seemed likely they had noticed something others had missed. If Ravenswood had been involved with the Baron in some clandestine way, there had to be a trail, one left behind in the most unassuming of places. Poirot made his way down to the kitchens, where the sounds of plates being cleared and low voices filled the air. The kitchen was bustling with activity, and the cook, a stocky woman named Mrs. Halloway, was the first to spot him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and nodding respectfully. "How may I assist you?" "I do not wish to disturb your work, madame," Poirot replied with a polite smile, "but I must ask, was there anything unusual in the household last night? Any strange sounds? Anything that struck you as out of place?" Mrs. Halloway gave a quick glance to the other staff members before speaking, her voice lowered. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd. I didn't want to say anything earlier, not until I was sure." Poirot leaned in slightly, his interest piqued. "What is it, madame?" "There was a man," she began, "came into the kitchen just before midnight, looking all around as though he didn't want to be seen. I thought at first it was one of the staff, but when I saw him more clearly, I realized he was a stranger. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, not like a guest, and he seemed nervous, as though he was expecting someone." "Did he speak?" Poirot asked, his tone intent. Mrs. Halloway nodded. "He asked if there were any bottles of wine left, and I told him there was a cellar full, but he didn't want wine. No, he said he needed something stronger. I gave him a bottle of brandy, and he took it with him, without paying for it, mind you. I didn't think much of it at the time. He didn't act like a regular guest or anything, so I just figured he was a friend of the Baron's, come for a late drink." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Did he leave the house after that?" "Oh, yes. Left in a hurry, as though he'd been expected for a certain time. Took the back exit. I didn't see him again." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The stranger's visit, so close to the Baron's disappearance, was no coincidence. Someone was manipulating the circumstances surrounding the crime, perhaps in an attempt to distract from the truth. He thanked Mrs. Halloway and turned to leave, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. But as he passed through the hall, his gaze fell upon a figure standing at the far end, partially obscured by the shadows. It was Lord Fenton. "Ah, Poirot," Fenton said, his voice tight with something unspoken. "I've been looking for you. I've reconsidered our earlier conversation, and I believe there's more to the situation than I initially let on." Poirot paused, regarding the man carefully. "Indeed. And what is it that you wish to reveal, my lord?" Fenton stepped closer, his expression grim. "I've been thinking about Ravenswood. You're right to ask about him. But there's something I must tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning." Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Fenton's sudden change in demeanor. "I'm listening." Fenton hesitated, then sighed. "Ravenswood and I were involved in a dangerous business years ago. It was never anything public, never discussed in polite society, but there was money. Quite a lot of it, enough to make things go wrong. I helped him once. I thought I could save him, but the consequences of that decision are still hanging over us." Poirot's interest piqued further. What was this business? What kind of consequences? "It doesn't matter now," Fenton said quickly. "But Ravenswood was desperate. He was running from something I couldn't help him escape. I warned him. I told him to leave, to disappear." "And did he?" Poirot asked sharply. Fenton's eyes flickered. "No, he came back." "Why?" Poirot pressed. "And what does this have to do with the Baron?" I don't know," Fenton admitted, looking as though he were struggling to hold his composure. "But I suspect Ravenswood came to settle old scores, to finish what he started years ago. And I think the Baron may have paid the price for my past mistakes." Poirot studied Lord Fenton for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them. The Baron's sudden disappearance, the mysterious note, and the clues leading to Ravenswood all pointed to a single conclusion. Ravenswood had returned, not just for vengeance, but for something much more personal. The Baron had become a pawn, caught in the web of a conflict that began long before his arrival at the estate. But Poirot was not yet ready to declare the case solved. No, there was one more step to take, one final element to understand. The Baron had not simply been an innocent victim caught in a dangerous game. He had been playing a part, whether knowingly or not. It was time to find out what role he had played in this elaborate puzzle. Poirot turned back to Lord Fenton, his expression resolute. "I will need to speak with the staff again, and I will need to see the Baron's study. There are pieces of this puzzle still missing, my friend, and I will not rest until I have them all." Fenton nodded slowly, his face pale. "Of course, I will show you." And as Poirot followed him toward the study, his mind was already racing, calculating the next moves in the game. He was certain now that the Baron's disappearance was no accident. But who was playing the game, and who was simply being played? And how far would the truth go in revealing the dark secrets of the past? It was only a matter of time before Poirot would find out. The study was an imposing room, dark wood paneling covering the walls, shelves of leather-bound books lining them, and heavy velvet drapes that seemed to absorb the light. It had the feel of a room designed for weighty decisions that were never to be made in haste. Poirot observed every inch as he entered, his keen eyes noting the subtle signs of someone who had not used the space for some time. A faint layer of dust gathered on the corner of the desk, but there were recent impressions in it, evidence that something had been moved, perhaps carelessly. The Baron's absence was marked here in the smallest details. Lord Fenton stepped to the side, his face clouded with unease. "As you can see, Poirot, there is nothing here that might be of use. It's a place for work, not secrets." Poirot said nothing, but instead moved toward the desk, running his fingers over the surface, brushing aside the dust where a drawer had been opened recently. A faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, something sharp and acrid, the kind of smoke one might associate with agitation or nervousness. He took a seat in the large leather chair behind the desk, allowing himself a moment to contemplate the scene. "What did Ravenswood want with the Baron?" Poirot asked softly, without looking up. Fenton's gaze darted toward the door, as if expecting someone to enter, then sighed. "I've already told you I don't know. It's been years since I last saw him. He was involved in, let's just say, a rather dangerous scheme. When he disappeared, I thought it was for good. But now he has returned." Poirot finished for him. "But why return to this estate? Why return to the Baron, someone who, I gather, had no involvement in your past dealings?" Fenton's face darkened, and he slowly walked over to the window, gazing out with a distant look in his eyes. "I'm not sure. It could be coincidence, or maybe not. The Baron has a reputation, you see. Wealth, power, influence, the kind of things that could make someone like Ravenswood take notice." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he stood and moved towards the bookshelf behind the desk. His hands slid over the titles without pausing, as though searching for something that was not immediately visible. And yet Ravenswood has not killed him, has he? He simply vanished. Fenton turned sharply. What are you suggesting? That he's still alive? Poirot's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. I suggest nothing, my friend. But it is curious, is it not? We find a room without a struggle, a baron whose disappearance seems almost too clean. No signs of violence, no hint of a fight. Just a missing man, as if he walked out on his own accord. There was silence in the room, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Fenton seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, and Poirot, ever patient, allowed the man his moment. Finally, Fenton spoke again, though his voice was tight with the strain of holding something back. "What are you saying, Poirot?" Poirot turned, his eyes unwavering. "I'm saying that the Baron did not vanish by his own volition, nor did he vanish at all. Someone has staged his disappearance, and that person is very close to us, I believe." Fenton's face paled, but he kept his composure. "And how can you be so sure of that?" Poirot raised an eyebrow, his voice soft but firm. "Because, mon ami, I've been observing every detail. The brandy bottle in the kitchen, the late-night visit from the mysterious man, Ravenswood's strange actions, and the Baron's study. You see, there is something that doesn't fit, a piece of the puzzle that doesn't align." Fenton stepped forward, his hands clenched. "What is it you want, Poirot?" Poirot looked around the study once more before stepping closer to the window. "I want to understand why the Baron is gone, but I also want to understand why you have been so eager to dismiss the idea that he may still be alive. Your response to the possibility, your denial, seems too certain, too swift." Fenton swallowed, clearly uneasy. "You are wasting your time, Poirot. The Baron is gone, and no one is hiding him." Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I do not believe you, my lord. Something happened here, and I am only beginning to understand its depth. Now, I will ask you once more. What were you and Ravenswood involved in?" Fenton's eyes flickered briefly with fear before he turned away, his back rigid. "I told you, it doesn't matter anymore." "I think it does," Poirot replied. "I think it matters greatly. You are hiding something." Just then, the door to the study opened, and a servant appeared with a message. The woman, a nervous-looking maid with wide eyes, handed it to Lord Fenton with trembling hands. "Message for you, sir, from the front gate," she said in a near whisper. Fenton's expression darkened as he took the message, tearing it open hastily. Poirot watched him carefully, the subtle shift in the man's demeanor not lost on him. "What does it say?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but probing. Fenton's eyes scanned the contents of the letter, and then his face drained of color. He stood still for a moment before crumpling the paper and throwing it into the nearby fire, watching it burn with an expression of barely contained frustration. He said nothing for several moments, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a growl. "They've found him," Fenton murmured, his voice shaking. "The Baron, he's been found." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The game was changing. No longer was it just a matter of a man's disappearance. Now it seemed there was something more, something darker. But what? The letter had ignited a spark, a new layer to the mystery that Poirot couldn't ignore. "What do you mean, they've found him?" Poirot asked. "Who has found him? Where is he?" Fenton shook his head as though lost in thought. I don't know. But there's something you should know, Poirot. Ravenswood is not just a man from my past. He's someone with a very particular set of skills. And he's capable of anything." Poirot took a step back, his eyes scanning Fenton's face as he considered the implications of the man's words. Ravenswood was no mere fugitive, no simple criminal. There was more at play here, and Poirot could feel the tension mounting. "And the Baron? Poirot asked again, his voice steady but forceful. What is Ravenswood's connection to him? Why now? Fenton finally met Poirot's gaze, his face grave. It's a matter of debts. Debts from long ago, debts that have come due. I only hope to God you're wrong about what's happening here. I can't bear to think about it. Poirot's mind was already racing, piecing together fragments. He knew now that this mystery was far from simple, and the key to solving it lay not in the evidence, but in the men who had been trapped in its web. The truth would be uncovered, piece by piece, but there was no doubt in Poirot's mind that this case would be unlike any he had encountered before. The danger was real, and the stakes higher than he had imagined. With a final glance at Fenton, Poirot turned and made his way toward the door, his thoughts already on the next steps. The Baron's disappearance was only the beginning. The game was on. Poirot left the study with a deliberate slowness, taking in every detail of the house. The way the lights gleamed faintly in the hallways, the muted sounds of the servants in the far-off rooms, the creaking of the old wooden floors, all of it spoke to a long-established order that was now beginning to break down. His mind was already working through the new information, assembling pieces that didn't yet fit together. The letter that Fenton had burnt so quickly still lingered in his thoughts. Someone had found the Baron, someone had tracked him down, and yet this person hadn't revealed their discovery immediately. Fenton's reaction had been telling, and Poirot knew that, whatever he had read, it wasn't the simple relief of someone who had lost a dear friend. No, it was something far more complicated, perhaps even more dangerous. As Poirot stepped into the hallway, he paused, hearing a slight shuffle from a nearby room. He turned toward it, his eyes narrowing. It was the sound of someone moving quietly, almost as though they were trying not to be heard. Poirot didn't need to wonder who it might be. He had already surmised that Lord Fenton was not the only one with secrets in this house. It was time to follow up on those hunches. He approached the door with a careful step, not wishing to alarm the person inside. His hand was light on the doorknob, and as he gently turned it, the door creaked open just enough for him to slip inside unnoticed. The room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn shut against the late afternoon sun. The only source of light came from a single lamp on the desk, casting long shadows across the walls. And there, at the desk, sat a woman. A tall, slender figure, with dark hair cascading over her shoulders, absorbed in what appeared to be a letter. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment, taking her in, noting the tense posture of her back, the way her fingers clenched slightly around the paper she was holding. She was not reading in the way one might read a letter of pleasant news. No, there was something more to her actions, something hidden beneath the surface. She didn't hear him approach, and so when Poirot spoke, his voice was calm, almost startling in its suddenness. "Mademoiselle, I hope I am not disturbing you." The woman jerked in surprise, quickly crumpling the letter and hiding it in her lap. Her eyes met Poirot's, and for a fleeting moment, Poirot could see a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a polite smile. "Detective Poirot, you startled me," she said, her voice steady but with a slight edge to it. "I did not expect you to be so stealthy." Poirot smiled gently, stepping further into the room and taking a seat across from her. "I do apologize, mademoiselle. I did not mean to startle you, but I must admit, I am curious. What is it that you are hiding?" Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Poirot could see a slight tremor in her hands as she placed the crumpled letter carefully on the desk, smoothing it with deliberate motions. "I have nothing to hide," she replied, her voice cool, but Poirot could sense the tension in the room, the way her gaze flickered toward the window as if expecting someone or something. "Ah, but that is not entirely true, is it?" Poirot replied, his voice soft but firm. "You were reading something, mademoiselle, something that caused you some distress." The woman's face hardened, and for a moment Poirot thought she might rise and leave. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, her expression composed. "You're a perceptive man, Poirot, but I assure you there is nothing for you to concern yourself with. I was simply handling a private matter." Poirot studied her carefully, noting the fine tremor in her voice, the way her fingers still lingered near the letter. She was hiding something. He could feel it. And yet, this woman was not the obvious culprit. She was too well groomed, too polished, to be someone who would casually involve herself in a kidnapping or a disappearance. But the game had only begun. "You are, of course, welcome to keep your secrets, mademoiselle," Poirot said slowly, "but I would be remiss if I did not ask. Do you know something about the Baron? His disappearance?" The woman's lips pressed tightly together, and for a moment she looked away. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, almost imperceptible. "I know more than I wish to, Poirot, and I can tell you this much. There is more to this story than meets the eye. But I cannot tell you more. Not yet." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You wish to protect someone. The question is, mademoiselle, who are you protecting?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You think you understand, but you don't. You haven't seen the truth yet. The Baron's disappearance is only the beginning. What follows will be far more complicated, more dangerous." Her words hung in the air, and Poirot could feel the weight of them, heavy and thick. There was fear in her voice now, raw and unguarded. Fear of something beyond her control. "And what is it that follows, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his tone quiet but insistent. But she only shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together as if to prevent further words from escaping. "You don't understand. Not yet." Poirot stood, offering her a polite nod. "Very well. But know this. Nothing remains hidden forever, mademoiselle. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, even when one tries to bury it, and I will find it." She said nothing in reply as he turned to leave, but the expression in her eyes was one of conflicted resignation. There was more to the story. He could feel it deep in his bones. Someone was lying, and that someone was closer than he had realized. Poirot was determined to peel away the layers, to get to the heart of the mystery that had gripped this house. The pieces were scattered, but Poirot knew how to assemble them, and soon, very soon, the truth would be laid bare. But for now he had one more question to answer. Where was the Baron? Poirot stepped out of the room, leaving Mademoiselle at her desk, the door softly clicking behind him. Her words echoed in his mind. Something far more dangerous was in motion, something that the young woman seemed reluctant, even terrified, to discuss. He had caught the fleeting look of panic in her eyes, and he knew that the fear she exhibited was not for the Baron. It was something else entirely. But what? His mind was already processing her cryptic statements, the conflict that simmered beneath her calm exterior. The Baron's disappearance, his connection to the mystery, and the peculiar reaction of the others, all of these threads twisted together in a knot that Poirot had not yet unraveled. But the truth, as always, would emerge, even if it had to be teased out of the darkness, piece by piece. Poirot paused in the hallway, his eyes narrowing. He could still feel the weight of the room's tension pressing against him. Whatever it was that the woman knew, it was tied to the Baron's fate, and it would not remain hidden for long. He had no intention of letting it slip through his fingers. As he walked back to the drawing room, his thoughts shifted. The final piece of the puzzle was still missing, the person who had orchestrated it all. Whoever had pulled the strings, manipulated the fear, and kept the others in line, was still among them. Poirot was convinced that the person he sought was hiding in plain sight. The drawing-room door opened, and Poirot entered with his characteristic poise, his mind ever sharp. The guests were still gathered in their scattered groups, though now there was a subtle shift in their behavior. Eyes followed Poirot as he crossed the room, the air thick with an unspoken question. What would he do next? Lord Fenton stood by the window, staring out at the estate, his posture stiff and distracted. Across the room, Sir Edward and Mademoiselle Duval engaged in hushed conversation, glancing over at Poirot now and then, their voices lowered. Poirot's gaze lingered on Fenton for a moment longer than necessary, noting the man's tense, rigid shoulders. It was as though he were trying to convince himself that all was well, though Poirot knew otherwise. He had seen the quick, almost imperceptible flicker of panic when the letter had been burned. The same unease that marked his every interaction since the Baron's disappearance. "Lord Fenton," Poirot called out, his voice calm but laced with a quiet authority. The man turned slowly, his expression neutral, though there was something in his eyes that betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Poirot, I trust your investigation is progressing." Poirot smiled. "Progress, yes. But we are not yet finished, mon ami. Not yet." The room fell silent at his words. Sir Edward and Mademoiselle Duval both looked up, curiosity plainly evident in their eyes. Poirot's sharp gaze swept across them, noting every twitch, every shift of the eyes. "I have a question for all of you," Poirot continued, his voice measured. "But before I ask it, I must request your full attention." The guests complied, though their reactions varied. Lord Fenton's gaze grew even colder, while Sir Edward shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mademoiselle Duval stood silently by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her gaze averted. Poirot took a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the back of the chair nearest to him. "We have all gathered here under the guise of a simple disappearance," he said slowly. "But there is something more at play, n'est-ce pas?" The atmosphere in the room shifted, a subtle tension entering the air, the kind of silent pressure that only Poirot's presence could create. "You all have something to hide," Poirot said softly, his eyes flicking from one guest to the next. "Each one of you is playing a part in a much larger game. The question, then, is who among you is pulling the strings?" For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the room itself had frozen, waiting for someone to speak. Poirot's words had hit the mark, but none of the suspects was willing to reveal their hand. "You accuse us of what exactly?" Lord Fenton's voice was colder now, edged with something like irritation. Poirot did not rise to the bait. Instead, he took a small step forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "I accuse no one, Lord Fenton. I only observe. The truth is always in the details, in the moments that others fail to notice." Fenton seemed to flinch imperceptibly, though it was clear he did not intend to show any more emotion. He steeled himself, his gaze hardening. Poirot continued, his voice low but commanding. "We know that the Baron's disappearance was not an accident. We know that the letter Mademoiselle Duval hid in her lap was not a simple note of condolence. We know that the fear in your eyes, Lord Fenton, is not the result of missing your friend. It is the fear of losing control of a carefully laid plan, a plan that has yet to come to fruition." There was a collective shift in the room, an unsettling movement as each of the suspects began to glance at one another with newfound suspicion. The game was no longer just a matter of deduction. Now it was a matter of trust. Who could they trust, and who was lying? Mademoiselle Duval stepped forward, her expression hardened. "You are wrong, Poirot. We are all victims in this, not conspirators. The Baron was no mere acquaintance. He was our friend, and his loss is deeply felt by each of us." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Perhaps, mademoiselle, but your words suggest a different reality. You claim to be a victim, but your hands are not as clean as you would have us believe. You know something you are not telling, and that, I am afraid, is where your involvement begins." She faltered for the briefest of moments, but just as quickly, she regained her composure. "I'm telling the truth," she said firmly, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I have nothing to hide." Poirot turned his attention to Sir Edward, whose discomfort had grown evident. The man's fingers tapped nervously on the arm of his chair, his eyes darting to the door as if calculating an exit. "And what of you, Sir Edward?" Poirot inquired. "You, who seem so eager to change the subject with every question I ask. What is it you fear?" The tension was unbearable now. The room was tight with suspicion and unspoken accusations, but no one was ready to reveal their secrets. Not yet. But Poirot knew they were all on the brink of collapse, each suspect teetering between confession and the desperate need to protect their own interests. And so, Poirot waited. With his patient gaze, he gave them time to reveal themselves, knowing that the moment of truth was drawing ever closer. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him, his gaze moving methodically from one guest to the next. The tension was palpable, an almost physical weight pressing down on the room. Not a single word was spoken for what felt like an eternity. The silence, as always, was a tool Poirot wielded expertly, giving each of them time to unravel in their own way. It was Sir Edward who broke first, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as though he were looking for an escape. His fingers tapped out an anxious rhythm on the armrest. "You're wrong, Poirot," he said, his voice strained but trying to sound composed. "There's no conspiracy here. No grand scheme. We're all just trying to make sense of what happened, just like you." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his lips curving slightly in that characteristic way. "Are you, Sir Edward? Are you really?" The question hung in the air, and Poirot let it linger, watching as Sir Edward's face twitched with uncertainty. Poirot knew all too well the way people tried to deflect suspicion, to present an image of innocence when their guilt was starting to eat away at them from the inside. Mademoiselle Duval's gaze was steady, though the faintest tremor in her fingers betrayed her. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "I told you, Poirot," she said, her voice tight with controlled irritation. "We know nothing. We've lost a friend, an important man to all of us." Poirot's eyes flicked over her, noting the subtle tightening of her posture, the way her voice rose just a fraction too much when she spoke of the Baron, as if trying to force a connection that hadn't yet been made. She was hiding something, no doubt, but Poirot wasn't prepared to pull it out just yet. His method was one of patience, and now was not the time to reveal everything. He turned his attention back to Lord Fenton, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were focused on Poirot with an intensity that bordered on hostility. There was a coldness in them, as though the man was willing to fight this game to the bitter end. Lord Fenton cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "This is preposterous, Poirot. You've spent all this time suggesting we are all involved in some grand conspiracy, but you have no proof. You've turned a simple disappearance into a farce. Perhaps it's time you admitted you're grasping at straws." Poirot did not flinch, though the insult was clear. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering the man. "Ah, Lord Fenton," he said with quiet calm, "your words are sharp, but they reveal more about you than you might intend. I wonder, why are you so determined to discredit me? Is it because you believe I'm getting too close? Too close to the truth?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Poirot could see the flicker of guilt behind Fenton's steely facade. But it was Mademoiselle Duval who reacted most strongly, her voice breaking the tension in the room. "Enough!" she cried, stepping forward. "This is ridiculous. We're all friends here. The Baron would never have disappeared without reason, and it's not like Poirot to speak of grand conspiracies without evidence." Her breath came quickly, her chest rising and falling in agitation. "We all have our secrets, but it's not up to you to drag them into the open." Poirot allowed her to vent, observing her carefully. There was a rawness to her words, an urgency that suggested she knew more than she was willing to admit. But Poirot's mind was already working, sorting through the fragments of information she had provided. Her words were laced with something more than just frustration. There was fear beneath them, and that fear was something Poirot would not let go of. He looked at her for a moment, considering. "I understand your distress, mademoiselle," he said gently. "But it is not distress I'm looking for. It is truth." Her eyes darted to the others, as if seeking some sort of support. But none came. Sir Edward was now silent, his fingers twisted in a nervous knot, his eyes focused on the floor. Lord Fenton stood by the window, his posture stiff and rigid, as though he were bracing himself for something. All three of them seemed to be on the verge of collapse, their facades cracking under the pressure. Poirot's gaze moved to the table where the letter had been burned. It was still an important clue, something that couldn't be ignored. His mind lingered on it for a moment longer, the possibility of what it could mean still unresolved. A letter that had been destroyed so hastily, so deliberately, it had to contain something important. "Mademoiselle Duval," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm. "There is something you know. You've been hiding it for far too long." She froze, her face paling, her eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was now a whisper, almost a plea. Poirot's eyes never wavered. The letter, it was not just a note. It was not a simple message of condolence. It was something more. You destroyed it because you could not let the truth come to light. Mademoiselle Duval's breath hitched, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. She began, but the words died in her throat. She swallowed hard, as though the weight of her own guilt had just caught up to her. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." At last, Poirot's patience was rewarded. The first crack in the wall of silence had appeared. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you do not need to hide any longer. You have already given so much away. Now it is time for you to tell the truth." Her shoulders slumped as the last of her resistance crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she whispered, almost to herself. "I didn't mean for it to end in murder." Poirot stepped closer, his voice soothing yet firm. "Murder? Tell me more, mademoiselle." For the first time since the Baron's disappearance, the young woman met his gaze fully. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she took a breath. The Baron wasn't supposed to be the one who died. It was meant for someone else. The room seemed to hold its breath. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy, waiting to suffocate anyone who dared to speak. "But why?" "Sir," Edward asked, his voice barely a whisper, the horror now creeping into his eyes. Mademoiselle Duval shook her head, a deep sadness in her eyes. The Baron had discovered something that would ruin all of us. He'd found out about the secret deal we were all part of. The money, the blackmail, the corruption. Her voice faltered, but Poirot's steady gaze kept her speaking. "We thought we could cover it up. We thought it was all under control." Poirot's expression remained calm, though his mind was racing. This was the key to everything, the heart of the mystery. The Baron had been murdered, not because of a petty grudge or jealousy, but because of a darker, more insidious truth that none of them wanted to confront. "The Baron was about to expose you all," Poirot said, his voice low but filled with quiet triumph. "And so, he had to be silenced." Mademoiselle Duval's tears spilled over, but she did not try to hide them. "I never wanted this. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." "But someone has," Poirot said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And now, mademoiselle, it is time for you to make amends." Mademoiselle Duval's eyes flickered between Poirot's calm, unyielding gaze and the others in the room. Her hands trembled at her sides, the weight of the truth settling heavily upon her. Sir Edward shifted nervously in his seat, his mouth dry, while Lord Fenton, his arms crossed tightly, watched with an expression that was now less defiant and more resigned. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Mademoiselle Duval to speak the words that would unravel everything. The silence stretched. Poirot did not rush her. He knew from experience that in moments like this, any pressure only forced a person further into themselves, hiding the truth even more deeply. He allowed her the time she needed, watching her closely, observing the subtle changes in her posture, the way her eyes darted, the way her breath became shallow. Finally, with a sound that was half a sigh, Mademoiselle Duval began to speak, her voice small but resolute. The Baron had no intention of exposing anything. He had no proof of anything, but he knew he had learned too much about our dealings, about the bribes, the schemes to defraud investors, the dirty money we used to buy our influence. He had been growing suspicious for weeks, and then, one night, he found something that made him realize we were all involved, even him. He believed it would be the end of everything for us. Poirot stepped forward, his face a study in concentration. And what did he plan to do with this knowledge? Surely he would not simply have left you all to live in fear of exposure. No, there was something more to his intentions. Mademoiselle Duval shook her head quickly, as though trying to dislodge an uncomfortable thought. He wanted to go public. He wanted to make sure we were all brought down together. He was going to write to the authorities, to the press, to anyone who would listen. But, Poirot pressed, he did not. Instead, he vanished, and you destroyed the evidence he left behind. Her lips pressed tightly together, as if she were weighing her next words carefully. He never got the chance. That night, I thought I could stop him. I confronted him. I told him he had no right to ruin us all, that there was a way to fix everything if we just kept quiet. I begged him not to expose the truth. And what did he say? Poirot's voice was calm, but his gaze never wavered. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said he would never stop. Not now. He had to. He didn't care what it would cost him. Her eyes met Poirot's, her vulnerability laid bare. That's when it happened. In the heat of the moment, She stopped herself, blinking rapidly as the horror of what she was about to admit struck her. I killed him. I didn't mean to. I never meant for it to happen. But I did. The room seemed to breathe in unison. Poirot held her gaze for a long moment, absorbing the gravity of her confession. He had suspected, but to hear it aloud, this was something else entirely. It was no longer theory or deduction, but the ugly truth of human frailty. Still, he had not expected such a raw admission, and yet, there it was. But why lie about it? Poirot asked softly. Why conceal the truth, mademoiselle? Why let us all search for answers when you knew from the start? Her tears were flowing freely now, but she did not try to hide them. Because I was afraid. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I destroyed the letter, if I erased the last piece of evidence that tied me to him, I could leave it all behind. I wanted to protect myself and everyone else. The others didn't know. They couldn't know. I couldn't let them think I was capable of murder, Poirot finished for her. Yet, mademoiselle, you are. And unfortunately, that is what you have done. Mademoiselle Duval trembled under his gaze, her hands twisting in her lap. I never meant for it to happen like this. I never wanted anyone to be hurt. Poirot's tone softened, but there was no pity in it. And yet someone has been hurt. Someone has lost their life. And others will suffer because of your actions. But what will happen now? Mademoiselle Duval whispered. What do I do? Will I be arrested? Will I go to jail? Poirot paused before responding, his mind already working through the various implications of her confession. There was still much to be done, many threads to tie together. But first, there were certain questions that needed answers. There is still the matter of the other guests, Poirot said quietly, turning his attention briefly to Sir Edward and Lord Fenton. Both of you were present that night. You knew about the Baron's suspicions. What did you do, or rather, what did you fail to do?" Sir Edward flinched slightly, a small bead of sweat forming on his forehead. He cleared his throat nervously. "We didn't know Mademoiselle, was capable of something like that." He swallowed hard, his words coming out in a rush. "But we did know about the Baron's threats. We didn't think it would lead to something like this. We thought he was just bluffing." Lord Fenton, his face rigid, added, "We didn't know what to do. We couldn't stop him from going public. But when Mademoiselle came to us with her confession, when she explained it all, we were too scared to involve the police." Poirot's gaze hardened. "So, you covered up the crime. You aided her in hiding the truth." They both nodded, their expressions guilty but resigned. Poirot's voice was quieter now, more thoughtful. "And yet, despite all this, you claim to have been friends of the Baron. He was your associate, your confidant. Yet when it came down to it, you abandoned him, just as Mademoiselle Duval did." A long pause followed, and Poirot could sense the guilt thickening in the room. Lord Fenton's eyes shifted uneasily from Poirot to Mademoiselle Duval. "We never meant for anyone to get hurt," Fenton muttered, as if seeking some form of redemption. Poirot raised a hand to silence him, his mind still processing the enormity of what had been confessed. "It is not enough to simply acknowledge the wrong, my friends. The damage has already been done." He turned his gaze back to Mademoiselle Duval, then slowly to Sir Edward and Lord Fenton. "The truth must come to light, and justice must follow. There is no more hiding. You all share in this crime now, whether you intended to or not." The room fell into a heavy, resigned silence. The truth had been spoken, and there was no turning back. Poirot had methodically laid bare their sins, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done, not to the Baron, nor to the lives of those now caught in the tangled web of deceit. Poirot's voice broke the silence once more, soft but resolute. "Now, it is time to face the consequences." As the realization sank in, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, and with it, the certainty that the investigation was nearing its end. Only one thing remained: the final reckoning.